And so what I actually think that advanced lifters end up doing is they'll often end up alternating between a conjugate program and a concurrent program, and a conjugate program and a concurrent program. And they'll kind of do those back and forth. And that concurrent program brings up all the abilities. And then they'll often go into that sequential system and they'll build kind of one at a time, and it builds on top of itself. You're listening to Barbell Logic, brought to you by Barbell Logic Online Coaching, where each week we take a systematic walk through strength training and the refining power of voluntary hardship.
Welcome to the Barbell Logic Podcast. I am Scott Hambrick. Scratching his head over there is the Matt Reynolds. And today...
But you guys can't see me. My hair's a little long right now. Can you tell that my hair's a little like...
Yeah, cut your hair and get a job, you dirty hippie.
I try to shave my head about once every 3 days, but it's been 4 days, and so I have one extra day of growth, and it starts to look like a... it starts to look like... never mind what it looks like. So
Looks like my sack.
No, I mean, I saw this Instagram post the other day, which is funny. I mean, I don't even look at Instagram anymore. I think I was just, I don't know, sitting on the toilet or something. And it was like this picture, I think it was some animal that had shed its hair and was kind of regrowing hair, and it would look real like it had almost like alopecia or something. It had like real like weird pattern baldness. And it was a joke. Some female made a joke like, this is what it looks like to shave when you're super pregnant. Right. And so that's kind of what my head looks like, because hair just comes in sort of random patches at this point because I'm old and have all that dihydrotestosterone.
Right.
So what are we talking about today?
We were going to talk about concurrent versus conjugate training. And something interesting has happened in the world where the meanings of those two have been flip-flopped.
Yeah,
right?
It's really interesting. Yeah,
Carl Shute and I talk about this all the time. Like, and you guys have probably observed this too. Like in the 70s, the word bad became, oh man, that is badass. That was good.
Yeah, right. It was good.
Right.
Yeah.
And now, literally, for all the people who I can't convince, the people in Southern California, the people that went to college after 98 and didn't study engineering, etc., literally means figuratively now. Like it means the opposite of what it meant. Yeah. They're like, oh, the food was so bad I literally died. No, I'm talking to you. You're fine.
Right.
These words flip-flop. And then
words don't mean the same thing they used to. Yeah.
Carl's favorite one is the word nice.
Uh-huh.
If you look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, which you get a subscription to when you join Online Great Books, nice in 1671 meant dissolute or wicked people as a class. So
weird.
Milton Milton, one of our favorites, he says, "Nothing will please the difficult and nice."
And you're like, what's going on?
He's talking about everybody. Like nice people. Yeah.
He's talking about both difficult people and nice people. Like, no, they're the same, or at least similar.
Yep.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, and then there's some earlier stuff from like the 1400s where this is like in Middle English. It says like God's grace serves to be cherished by the good and chastised by the nice. So these words flip-flop.
You're like, wait a minute, what?
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense. Yeah. How strange. That's strange.
So in common use, what the Westside people call conjugate is actually concurrent.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so Louis, I think, was a member of the original Westside Barbell Club in Culver City, California, and he, certainly before the internet and before the Russian Soviet texts had been translated into English, before communism had fallen, finding out anything about the way those guys trained, the Soviets trained, was, was few and far between, very, very difficult to get your hands on anything. And so somehow Louis, as he learned at the original Westside Barbell, and then as he became the proprietor of the current Westside Barbell in Columbus, Ohio, he said that what they did was conjugate training. They did max effort work every week, and often every workout or most workouts. They did dynamic effort work or speed work, power work every week, and they would do what they would call the repetition method, which is really just hypertrophy work. And so they were doing all three of those all the time. It's like, conjugate training. Wrong. Not conjugate training. That's concurrent. So,
Concurrent means you do everything in parallel. Currently.
well, it doesn't necessarily mean everything, but it does mean you're developing multiple physical abilities at the same time. Right? So like for a strength sport, we're probably not developing significant muscular endurance or aerobic base at the same time but we certainly in concurrent training where we're developing multiple physical abilities at the same time, we might actually be developing maximal strength, explosive strength or power, that's power, right? And hypertrophy at the same time. Whereas conjugate, which is interesting, actually talking about the word, so conjugate in Latin is the combination of the word con, which is together, and jugum, I think, which is yoke.
I'm looking at it.
So it literally means yoked together, like yoked together. And the Soviets didn't call it conjugate. They called it the coupled sequence system, the CSS.
Yes, from the transitive Latin to yoke together, to join, to couple.
Yeah. So it's coupled. That's right. So it's a coupled and then the second word is important too. The Soviets called it the conjugate system, the coupled sequence system. And what it is, it's sequential, right? Meaning that what the Soviets did is they had a bunch of exercises, like something between 20 and 45 exercises, depending on the lifter and how advanced they were. And they sequentially built off one another in order to drive that lifter or that athlete to the peak. By the way, let me start here. The conjugate system was not originally invented for powerlifters.
Right.
And the reason why is because there was no such thing as powerlifting at the time. Not only that, as far as I can tell, the conjugate system was actually not necessarily originally invented for weightlifters either. It was actually originally used on throwers, on shot putters, that Anatoly Bondarchuck was their coach. And he worked, he was both their throwing coach and their strength coach. And he worked closely with Zetsiorsky and Verkoshanksy and these guys that were the Russian Soviet coaches. And they were doing this stuff with the weightlifters certainly as well. And they started to realize that if we use a bunch of different exercises, we can start very general and we can sequentially place these exercises to become more specific and more specific and more specific and more specific to the thing we're trying to compete in. That's conjugate training. Now, the development of that Russian conjugate system started, it is intimately tied to their government, right? The communist form of government, what they did is they gathered up all their kids and they actually didn't start them with what they called general exercises. They started them with what they literally called non-specific exercises. So you had non-specific, and then you had general, which looked kind of like the thing you were trying to do, and then you had specific, which looks exactly like the thing you're trying to do. And they took all their kids, and they exposed all the kids, like in the whole country. They exposed all their kids to all these different motor patterns. So all of the children, and they did it via playing, right? So we think about, when I think, you probably do too, when I think of communism, right, I think it's just like this real, like, tough, Rocky IV, everybody's like, it's drill sergeants for everybody, including the 5-year-olds.
Right.
And it wasn't great. It was fucking terrible, actually. Like, hundreds of millions of people died under the thing. But in their drive to beat the West, they would expose their kids to many, many, many different motor patterns. All the kids would play soccer. All the kids would do gymnastics. All the kids would do trampoline. All the kids would swim. All the kids would do calisthenics, basic like body weight type exercises. And that would start to expose kids to where they were better than others. If they were good athletes, and specifically gymnastics, or if they were calisthenics or high end jumping, they'd be like, it's maybe gymnastics, maybe it's weightlifting. They start to move them down that line. And then they would just progressively, sequentially train these people. And that was that we've talked about it on the show. We call it here in the West the long-term athletic development model, the LTAD. They called it the PASM, the process for achieving sports mastery. And it was a systematic, sequential walkthrough to move somebody from a normal person, a child, to a master of sport is what they did. And so they did that conjugate type training. Louis then started to use concurrent. And actually, the first time I read both of these terms was in super training, and I actually looked at it. I was like, I thought that's where it was. I couldn't remember if it was in Science and Practice of Strength Training or Super Training by Siff and Verkoshanksy. In my book, the first mention of these things is on page 290. I think in the newer editions, it's like on 292. And he actually defines both of those terms on the same page. And the Soviets really developed both of those, but their concurrent training is really what the kiddos did, right? The little kids were doing all that stuff. And they noted that concurrent training all of these facets at the same time, was something that would be used even on competitive athletes, but it was on a little more of the lower class of competitive athletes. And that when you were required to really perform at a thing, at throwing a shot put or at snatch and clean and jerk, then at some point you had to focus on that thing, be very specific, and they would convert people over from concurrent training to more conjugate sequential style training in order to get the most out of that person for that specific sport. Make sense?
Yeah, and we're not trying to just nerd out and say that Louis is wrong or anything like that, but traditionally in the programming world, these words were used differently than they often are on the forums and stuff on the internet today. And if you hold in your mind what they mean, like traditionally, then the meaning and the usage aligns with the actual words, and you can start to organize what's going on in your head a little better.
That's right.
And something that's interesting to me about this is that it's just like periodization. You can use these ideas to train and program for any athletic endeavor. You know, you said throwing, weightlifting. Nowadays, it's powerlifting. It could be bicycling. It could be anything. You know,
sure. It's actually most simple for powerlifting. That's the thing, right? Because strength training for powerlifting is specific. Mm-hmm. Strength training for football is generic. It's general. I'm trying to have actual, structural changes occur via the strength training that makes the football player better. But there's nothing specific about a squat or a deadlift for a football player. It's all general. But a squat and deadlift is specific for a power lifter. It's the actual thing they're being tested on, right? So to me, to actually apply these things, the simplest way to apply these things is to a power lifter. We can actually talk about what that looks like. We've talked about, I think we did a show called All Roads Lead to Block. Mm. And I do think at some point all roads lead to block.
And then do they lead through block to full-blown concurrent DUP?
Well, yes and no. So let's talk about that. So first off, concurrent. When we talk about developing multiple physical abilities at the same time, what is the ultimate sport that does that?
Probably maybe CrossFit.
Definitely CrossFit. Now, to me, that's the most complex style programming there is. And the caveat there is probably, well, certainly for somebody like Rich Froning, I think that Rich Froning's training didn't matter as much as we sort of wish it did. I think Rich Froning was just made to be a CrossFit champion. He was genetically superior to most of the other people.
Well, let's talk about Matt Fraser.
Yeah, so he probably is a little more like a true concurrent training athlete, where he, in CrossFit, we often use the terms like jack of all trades and master of none. He's jack of all trades and pretty good at all.
Yep.
That's Matt Fraser. But he's not the best at anything, right? Like, he's not stronger than the strongest strongmen.
Right.
He doesn't clean and jerk more than the best weightlifters. He doesn't run faster than the people in the Olympics, like for endurance or sprinting.
Who do you think wins at their best? Fraser or Froning?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it depends on, that's the part of the deal is the games. If I knew what the games entailed each year,
right,
I could probably give you a better, I don't know. It would be fun to have seen Froning in his absolute peak against Fraser in his absolute peak. But, that's the stories that every sport has, right?
Sure.
You tell those stories like
Tyson or Ali.
That's right. Like who would have been, so it would have been Tyson.
Yeah, Fraser is just more of a dump truck of a guy. I mean, he's a bigger guy. He's probably a little stronger. Yeah, I don't
Started
know.
started with a strength base, and then moved into the training all those other abilities to get better. And so the question you asked is, do you end up moving through block training, which is conjugate? So so block is a form of conjugate training, right? We've got lots of podcasts where we talk about that. We don't have to break all that down.
So let's describe how. Like in the beginning, you're doing hypertrophy work, right? In the accumulation phase.
Yeah, primarily it's volume is high, intensity, and intensity is not low. For a strength athlete, it's never low, but intensity is in the 65 to 75% range ish in the first block, and that first block is usually like 4 weeks long. At least it's an easy way to think about it. It's like a 4 week long block. It's high volume. It's a lot of hypertrophy work.
Yep.
And the exercises are often more general. So you can pick general exercises. You don't have to pick super specific exercises. As long as they generally get the job done, that's the goal.
Yep.
And then you move to the next block, which is an intensification or a transmutation block. Those words are used interchangeably, and I think they're used interchangeably because of the way they've been translated over from the Russian terms. And that is a block where both intensity and volume are relatively high. Their intensity is going up significantly. Intensity gets pretty damn high, all the way up to probably 90% intensity. And the volume remains certainly moderate. Now, we talked about this the other day. Somebody talked about uncoupling intensity and volume. Like, you can't uncouple intensity and volume.
I know.
I would love to do 99% of my deadlift max for 5 sets of 5.
I like to think about that, but I wouldn't like doing that.
Right. And it's just impossible. You can't do it. So they have a direct relationship with each other, right? It's as one goes up, the other one has to come down. And if it doesn't, you get a tremendous amount of fatigue built up, and it can't be sustained. But that's what the intensification or transmutation block does. It actually drives up the weight on the bar to really heavy, and then maintains still pretty high volume. The volume peels off a little bit from that first block, but not a lot. And we know that they can't sustain that very long. But what we're trying to do is take the athlete into an overreaching phase. We're trying to get that fatigue built up so that the stress is enough to force a tremendous disruption of homeostasis, but not so much that we drive the person into the ground and kill them, overtrain them. They can't recover. If you do it right, that phase, you take them to a place they've never been before from a stress and fatigue place, and then you peel back the volume like crazy in the final block, and you drive up the intensity from 90 and it makes slow incremental changes to 92 to 94 to 96, whatever. And they peak and get real, real strong. They adapt, they recover and adapt and become really, really strong. So that's what that block training looks like. Now, can you go from that to concurrent style training? Can you? Well,
Sure.
Obviously you can. Are there times when it would be appropriate?
I think so.
I think so too. So one of the most common forms of concurrent style programming today is called DUP, daily undulating periodization. What does undulate mean?
Just to wave.
Yeah, to wave. It just means it's going up and down. It's going up and down. It's a wave, right? And what it's saying is that daily, the stress and really the intensity, the volume, etc., are waving from day to day in a week.
Goes up and down like a sine wave.
That's exactly right. However, if you look at week 1 of a DUP program and you look at week 16 of a DUP program, let's say it's a 16-week long program, the volume still went down over those 16 weeks and the intensity still went up, didn't it?
Yep.
If the goal is strength. If the goal is volume, or if the goal is hypertrophy, maybe it does the opposite. Maybe the volume goes up over time. But for us, for strength athletes, people are trying to get stronger, that it does that. So here's my argument for DUP that I like about a DUP type program. When it's been done for even 6 weeks, when you have 6 weeks or so, 6-8 weeks under your belt, your body's sort of adapted to that DUP system, you are very, very close to being able to peak any of those abilities that you're training. So if you are training maximal strength or explosive strength or hypertrophy or even muscular endurance, within a 2 or 3 week period, you can peel off all of the other ones and peak one, right? That's pretty easy to do. You're very, very close to being able to just walk into a meet 3 weeks from training. You could just be like, man, I'm feeling pretty good. There's a meet 3 weeks away. Let's peak and let's go see if we can hit PRs. And it tends to work pretty well with DUP. For people who are good and advanced.
Good.
But I will still,
when you say good, do you mean that are skilled? Or do
that
you mean,
are, no, I just mean that are clearly advanced and strong, like no shit strong.
Okay.
They're strong and advanced. But I would still make the argument that for people who are world-class level strength, that you can't really keep driving up multiple physical abilities to a world-class level and then peel off a few of those and in 2 or 3 weeks, walk in and set all-time world records in powerlifting. And it's very difficult to do. And so what I actually think that often advanced lifters end up doing is they'll often end up alternating between a block program or a conjugate program and a concurrent program and a conjugate program and a concurrent program. And they'll kind of do those back and forth. And that concurrent program brings up all the abilities. And then they'll often go into that sequential system and they'll build kind of one at a time and it builds on top of itself. And I think that's what you tend to see people do who are the most successful. They'll kind of go back and forth over periods of like quarterly, training those things per quarter, going back and forth. And then experimenting with how the peak works.
Yeah, so when someone's very, very advanced, you've got to look at your big calendar probably and look at the next year, the next 18 months, put their vacations on there, put the meets on there that they want to work up to, and then you can start
working backwards,
working backwards and blocking off periods of training where you're going to have like a mesocycle of block or mesocycle of this sort of DUP stuff. But you got to have a 30,000 foot view,
which is the macro
training
cycle,
at that
right?
point.
We've talked about that on the podcast. So I'm like, everybody has a microcycle, novices all the way to world class, and I would argue that a novice doesn't really have a mesocycle, which is kind of the next step, or a macrocycle. Like every day, I mean, theoretically, Monday is
it's all those
the
things,
microcycle, the mesocycle, and the macrocycle. It's all three, right? And then when you get to like weekly programming to month-long program, that big picture program really is just probably the mesocycle. You're on a month-long program, that's a mesocycle. Yeah. You really don't necessarily have a macro either. You're just every 4 weeks, you're repeating a cycle. And when you get to advanced programming where you're doing a true conjugate style program or a true concurrent style program, like it's a 12-week to 16-week long program, that's really when you've got to have that 30,000 foot view. And you have to say, well, what does not just the next 12 to 16 weeks look like, but what does the next year look like? What are the next 4 of these 12-week programs look like? So I can see what the next year, and that is what a true macro cycle is. It's like the big, giant picture of the whole thing. How does this fit into the grand scheme of the long-term development of the lifter is real important, for sure.
Yeah, Charity competed in nationals in January and has elected to not compete whatsoever since then, and her big macro cycle culminates on November 16th.
At the next nationals.
She already had a qualifying total. She's ready to go. She doesn't have anything to prove, doesn't need any practice. So she's been waiting for that. And so all of her programming since January, about the 16th through November 16th, has all been built to culminate on that particular day.
Yep.
And she's done a little of all these things along, and she's getting a little beat up. She's not injured. She's getting pretty darn fatigued, but it's been going very,
probably
very
where
well.
she should be right about now. Right?
Yeah. Yep. It's
we're less than 2 months out.
Today's the 19th. Yep.
Yeah, so we're 7 weeks. I remember Mariusz Pudzianowski, the great Polish strongman who won like I think 4 or 5 World's Strongest Man.
Did people call him Pooge for short?
I don't think so.
I would. What's up, Pooge?
He's the most jacked strongman ever. He only competed at the World's Strongest Man. There was at that time, and there probably still is, I don't know, the winner of the World's Strongest Man got to defend his crown And so he didn't do any of those. He was a star in Poland, a huge star, like TV star, reality TV shows, commercials. He'd do commercials for like Coca-Cola and Fage yogurt and stuff like that. Like it was crazy.
The pooch
so he
for
didn't
Coke.
need, a lot of these, the Americans and the Western Europeans, they do all these competitions and all these shows and so because they're basically like they're on tour. They're like a band playing a tour. And it culminates for those strongmen at the World's Strongest Man and at the Arnold, which is probably equally about as big in their world, even though it's not quite as big maybe for the community. So that's kind of interesting. So, okay, I want to talk a little bit more about Westside because it's actually near and dear to my heart right now. Let me tell you why. So I've developed a Westside program, and it's funny that I say that because we don't really do any program anymore. We just MED change, right, until we get somebody here. But I've got a couple athletes I have been experimenting and beta testing with. I knew about 6 to 12 weeks out that I wanted to move them into this style of training, and so I started making individual changes to sort of progress them there and do what my version of Westside is. And when I say it's my version of Westside, I think it's sort of become the norm of people who the basic layout of this, the way most people do Westside. And I want to compare it to what Westside was from a programming perspective when I first got into it in the late 90s, mid to late 90s, right? So in the mid to late 90s, you would train to be a 4-day split. And that 4-day split would include a max effort day for upper body and a max effort day for lower body. So you would do a max effort lift, most often to a single, to a heavy single. And then you might do some back off work as well with it. And then you would go to like your accessory movements, right? Rarely did you actually train the squat and the deadlift in the same day. And they never really trained the press. It was really, really rare that they would train the press. So they would train, it's obviously they're competitive powerlifters, so they're training the bench press. So if they pressed, it was just to be used as a supplemental exercise, like as one of those exercise variations to drive up the bench press. And then they would have 2 days they called dynamic effort days. And this is where they would really put on all those bands and chains and do the accommodating resistance and stuff. Bands really change things for Westside, and they would do things that it would be high power work, explosive strength work. It would be work in like the 50 to 60% range, maybe 50% range of bar weight, plus an additional 20 to 30% band tension weight, so that you were utilizing like 80%, 70 to 80%. And you would hit that for like, on the upper body lifts, you'd hit it for like 8 sets of 3 or 9 sets of 3. And on the lower body stuff, you'd do like 8 sets of 2. And the reason Louis said that is because the sets of 2 in the lower body took about as long as a set of 3 would take on the upper body. He had some sort of like theory on the total amount of time that should take to complete one of those sets. It was like 4 seconds or something, 5 seconds, whatever it was. And they would follow up those main lifts, those max effort lifts or those speed work lifts, those dynamic effort work lifts with a bunch of volume work, a bunch of bodybuilding stuff, basically is what they did. And that's the original Westside Barbell program. And so they were a concurrent program weekly. So in the period of a week, they would train max effort strength, they would train explosive strength or power, and they would train volume. Now what you see with Westside style training, even of the guys that are training at Westside a lot of times, is a max effort lift first, which might be to a 1 rep max, it might be to a 3 rep max, maybe it's a 5 rep max, it's something heavy, maybe it's a couple back off sets, followed by the dynamic effort method of the other lift. So I might do max effort squats, and I would pick a variation of the squat. So it often wouldn't be the competitive squat. It would be a variant of that. I'm going to come back to the variant here in a minute. Followed by a dynamic effort version of the deadlift, right? 6 sets of 3 on the 6 sets of 2, 8 sets of 2, something like that on the deadlift with bands. And that dynamic effort piece for the deadlift is usually a normal competitive deadlift with bands added. It's typically what's done. Followed by repetition work. So every single workout has max effort work, speed work, and repetition work, volume work, hypertrophy work, whatever you want to call it, which clearly makes it concurrent and not conjugate at all. Now, where is the part that is still conjugate? Because now I'll argue that what modern day Westside is actually both. if done correctly, those max effort exercises are put in a sequential system to build off of one another. And this is the thing that Louis didn't do for a long time, and I think he screwed this up. They used to ask Louis on those I still have all those old VHS tapes, the old Westside Secrets tapes. And they'd say, how do you pick what max effort exercise you're going to do? They'd say, we just argue about it in the gym every morning. We come in, on max effort squat day, and some guys say, hey, we're going to do banded box squats today. And maybe another couple guys are like, let's do good mornings. Let's do deadlifts. And they fight about it a little bit. Then, okay, let's fine. Let's do banded box squats today. And the next week we're doing good mornings. Okay, got it. Boom. Here we go. Well, there's no real sequential system there. And I think that people, as they've started to lay this out to see how it works, you can lay out very general lifts for those max effort exercises and then build on each other. And here's what I'll typically do. Those max effort exercises will usually start lower in weight and greater in range of motion or tempo or something, right? So it's like a tempo lift, or maybe it's a deficit deadlift, right? It's an ultra wide paused bench press with a 2-second pause.
Of course.
Whatever, right?
Right.
So just think about it's a lift that makes it that's harder than the main lift. That's a longer range of motion that you're going to end up using less weight on the main lift. And then those are going to build on each other, right? So maybe let's use the press. So on the press, we might start with a seated press. So you're going to do a seated press without back support first. And I'm usually going to have my lifters do that for 1 week for a 3-rep max, and then the next week for a 1-rep max with a couple drop sets afterwards. So the first week is a 3-rep max, drop 10% for 3 sets of 3. So you're going to do 4 sets of 3 total. Next week is a 1-rep max, drop 12% for 3 sets of 3, right? That's what they're going to do. And they're going to change the exercise to something else. After seated press, what might you do? Well, you might actually do a standing normal strict press, right? A strict press standing up for a couple weeks. And then you might do a press lockout for a couple weeks. And then the last few weeks, you're going to go to your actual competition style press with some press starch thrown in at the end. And you can see how those could sequentially build on one another. You're starting with a very light movement, big range of motion, lots of slow tempo, lightweight, hypertrophy, more specific, PR. That's the idea. And then you repeat the cycle over, and whatever they hit for the seated press 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, they're going to try to beat that 8 weeks later and 9 weeks later. They'll do the same thing. So I would argue that modern day Westside is actually both concurrent and conjugate. They're training multiple facets of physical abilities all at the same time, but they're also tending to use those exercise selections in a way that sequentially builds on one another and leads to a big strength gain. So, make sense?
It does make sense. And this will just fit right in with the MED thing. There's a time where you can't just keep your rep scheme the same from week to week and or day to day, even within the week, and using these concepts will help you move from the sort of late intermediate to early advanced, or even late advanced. You have nowhere to go at some point.
Yeah.
And you have to do those things.
Yeah, I think there's a time for everybody where they need to do a bunch of max effort work. I really do. I think I think you learn something about yourself in the same way that we've done shows and talked about that the first time you really start to learn how to grind towards the latter third of LP, you learn something about yourself when you learn how to grind. Max effort training's tough. And there's a mental part to it where it's kind of scary coming in. The interesting thing about the way Westside works as opposed to DUP is that you're really going in, you're hitting a 3-rep max or 1-rep max every week. Not just every week, every day. Every day. Monday you're going to come in, you're going to hit a 3-rep max or 1-rep max on a squat variant. Tuesday you're going to come in and do the same thing on bench press. Thursday you're going to come in and do the same thing on deadlift. Friday or Saturday you're going to do the same thing on press. And the reason you don't stagnate and overtrain is because you keep changing the exercise and you sequentially build on each other with the exercise selection from more general to more specific. And so you can start to see how the lines become blurred and can easily become blurred between concurrent and conjugate programming. Likewise, if we take our standard block style programming that we've done in the past, the way we start to move block style programming to concurrent DUP style programming is the first thing we often do is we'll just add an additional press or bench press based on whether the person is a strength lifter or a power lifter. So now they're going to bench press 3 times a week and press 2 times a week. So they're going to do some form of pressing from 4 times a week to 5 times a week. Well, where does that extra press go? It goes on a lower body day. Well, now it's not just a lower body day. It's a max effort squat, or it's a heavy squat, a strength squat, a power bench press, and a hypertrophy deadlift. Well, now that's a full body. And then you just keep doing that, and you keep adding, okay, now we're going to add a third deadlift, or now we're going to add a third squat, depending on what exercise we want to start moving towards. And so those lines can become blurred, yeah, and it gets a little bit gross, a little bit muddled, but the thing about it is that you can very easily make minimum effective dose changes to move someone from one of these programs to the other without just completely changing their style of programming. We don't want to do that very often. So that's what I've been doing. It's been working. I've been doing that with Michael Burgos. Dude, he's gotten super strong, super fast. I've been doing it with Brett McKay. Brett McKay's getting super strong, super fast. And remember, these are all guys that were strong anyway, right? These are guys that are, Burgos was squatting over 500 pounds, and he's deadlifting high 5s, or close to 6. Brett's squatting in the high 4s, and he deadlifts over 6. So these are guys that are already strong who have never done this before. I'm starting to play around with it with Harry Fafudis. He just had him buy bands. I'm getting ready to start having Will Morris do it. And all these guys are about the same level of advancement, of training advancement. They're all pretty damn strong. They've all gotten pretty damn strong from the main lifts and some block training with some supplemental exercises. And it's just time. It's just time to let them start to learn how to hit big, heavy 3-rep maxes and 1-rep maxes every workout for probably a period of 16 weeks or so. We're going to do this. And maybe more. We're going to do it as long as it works. So,
yeah, that's the answer. You do it as long as it works.
So often people will say there are 2 types of training. We're either going to do block or DUP. And that's not necessarily wrong, but the real overarching philosophy behind that training is you're really doing either conjugate or concurrent or some combination of both at some point.
There's another Barbell Logic podcast. Do you have anything else to say about that, Matt Reynolds?
No, that's it. So I wish Louis hadn't screwed up the words.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter that he
called
did.
It conjugate.
And I want to say this again because a bunch of people are going to spurg out on this. It doesn't really matter that he did.
Yeah.
Right? Because what he's doing works and helps people get stronger.
That's right.
So just saying, he's using a weird word there doesn't mean that we don't respect that work. But
no. The guy's done tremendous. Like, well, I think he's sort of old and semi-senile now. The work he's laid, the guy's the godfather of powerlifting, and he's done tremendous work there. It's really just frustrating for guys like us who run a podcast, which is an audio-only show, when you're trying to explain using words, and the words that were picked were defined incorrectly.
Little wonky. Yeah. So when you go back,
it just made my life hard, but that's fine.
Yeah. What he's doing works and is the right thing to do for certain people in a certain point of their career. But when you start digging into the old literature, it bumps you, and you really have to sort those terms out in your head so you can see where he fits in sort of the programming genealogy, maybe.
Yeah.
So there's another show. Send your questions to questions@barbell-logic.com, and we will answer those for that Saturday show. And go to barbelllogic.com and sign up for the Friday Fives. We never give your email to anyone else. We just use that email address you give us to communicate with you and stay in touch with you. In case the rest of the internet blows up and iTunes blows up, we'll still have that email, and we can always get together through that. So send that, go there, and we'll make it worth your while. Send you all kinds of interesting content and flesh out some of these ideas you hear on the podcast in writing there oftentimes. So go get that.
Absolutely.
And we will talk to you guys soon. Thanks. The Pooge for Coke.